Okay.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me once again as we walk through the Gospel of Matthew. Today we're in chapter 8, and we're going to be discussing who's in charge, as Matthew tries to explain to us the amazing authority that Jesus has. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then the teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Another disciple said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me. Let the dead bury the dead." Kind of a bizarre statement there, but Jesus is trying to impress the people with what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. It means leaving all things. When they saw the miracles of Jesus, when they sort of saw the signs and people talking of him possibly being the Messiah, everyone was very gung-ho. Everyone wanted to jump on board. Let's get on this bandwagon. Let's join the revolution against the Roman Empire. And this is finally Israel's going to take over the world. They had a very wrong image of the Messiah. And so when they heard these rumors and heard his teaching and saw his power, they wanted to jump on board. They wanted to join him. And Jesus is letting them know it's not that kind of revolution. Jesus let them know that you follow me, you're going to be as homeless as I am. I have no place to lay my head. I own nothing. Were they really willing to make that sacrifice? He wanted to let them know the price is heavy to be a follower of Jesus Christ. Christian discipleship is very radical. He says, let the dead bury the dead. That's such a cryptic thing to say. It's such an offensive thing to say. If you go into any different culture, I was trained in this as a missionary, that anthropologically, the most cultural elements about any given culture are weddings and funerals. For him to tell him, don't worry about the funeral of your parents, had to be a 2x4 between the eyes. A very offensive thing to say. And Jesus is obviously using hyperbole here, but he's letting him know, when you decide to follow Jesus, you leave it all behind and you follow Jesus. That every other decision, every other priority, every other value in your life takes a secondary priority to the cost of following Jesus, to the commitment of following Jesus. And so he's letting this guy know, you can't worry about the things of this world. We don't know if the guy's father had already died or if he would die soon. But Jesus is telling him, if you decide to follow me, then you follow me. Don't worry about the rest of these things. The call to follow Jesus is extreme. People need to understand that. We all need to understand that it's not sort of a social club or a side thing that we participate in, that following Jesus becomes the center of our lives, the paradigm by which we make all other decisions. And he's trying to impress that on these people who have a different notion of what kind of Messiah he is. The call is extreme. It calls for self-sacrifice. It always has been. It always will be. This is one of the problems I think the church has struggled with through the centuries, is that we tend to get comfortable. We tend to relax. When the church is persecuted, the church grows. But when the church gets accepted by society, it suddenly starts getting lazy, getting a little apathetic, getting comfortable, wanting to fit in instead of be radical followers of Jesus Christ. Following Jesus is an all-or-nothing venture. And too often I see Christians struggling because they're trying to make it a some venture instead of an all venture. And I always loved the way my sister would talk to her kids when she said, clean all the room, and she'd go in and find the closet still messy. She'd ask them, which part of all did you not understand, the A or the two L's? It means all. It's all in. when you follow Jesus. Then Jesus got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Without warning, a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him and saying, "Lord, save us! We're going to drown." He replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up, and he rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him?" You see, the authority of Jesus is all-encompassing. And they hadn't quite figured out what was going on. Some of these men were fishermen who'd fished on the lake, on the Sea of Galilee for their whole lives. And so if they were scared, this storm must have been pretty serious. They were experienced fishermen, experienced on the water, and they knew our lives are being threatened, or so they thought. But it didn't occur to them that if Jesus is the Messiah, if he's truly the Son of God, a little storm isn't going to bother him. In fact, he wasn't just along for the ride, he was asleep during this storm. If you've ever been on a ship in a storm at sea, you kind of know what they felt like. It's pretty awesome. You can be on a big cruise liner, but I remember when I was young, we were on a ship coming from Japan back to America, and we got into a hurricane. And suddenly that big ship didn't seem so big when you saw 100-foot waves rolling in. You have a new respect for the power of the ocean. But what they needed to gain was a new respect for the power of Jesus Christ, that when he's in charge, nothing can threaten him. They just still hadn't figured out who Jesus is yet. And I think a lot of us still struggle with that today, really understanding who he is, what he stands for, and how powerful his authority is. The elements obey Jesus' word because he is the Word of God. In the beginning, God spoke the word, and the earth was created, and it was good. Just by his spoken word, things came into being. And so we need to understand if Jesus is the Word, as John tells us, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and he was with God. If he is the Word of God, then his word is all-powerful. His authority is all-encompassing. We need to understand that, get our heads around that. When he arrived at the other side in the region of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. "What do you want with us, Son of God?" they shouted. "Have you come to torture us before the appointed time?" Some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. The demons begged Jesus, "If you drive us out, send us into the herd of pigs." He said to them, "Go." So they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water. Those tending the pigs ran off, went into town, and reported all of this, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. Then the whole town went out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they pleaded with him to leave their region. Interesting story. The other side, when Matthew says, Jesus said, let's go to the other side, that's a way of saying not our side. In other words, it was a Gentile region. These were not our people. And the Jews would become unclean if they came into contact with these people. I'm sure his disciples were somewhat wondering, why does he want us to go to the other side? They may have even thought the storm came up on the sea as a curse from God because they were going to the other side. But no, in fact, it was a way of displaying God and Jesus' power and authority, even over the elements. The herding of pigs makes it pretty clear this was a Gentile region. Jews had nothing to do with pigs in the first century. if they were to maintain their kosher laws. Now, it was well known that there was a crazy, naked, demon-possessed man in this area. They're living in the caves of this region, and that region should be avoided because of that. I mean, if you walked around that area at night and you heard this crazy guy running around naked, screaming and yelling, we get from the other gospel stories that people had tried to restrain him with chains and he had broken them, that he's incredibly strong. You can almost imagine the parents of rebellious teenagers saying, if you don't behave, that crazy guy's going to come in here and get you. Everyone in this area knew about this demon-possessed crazy guy in the caves, and they tried to stay away from it. They tried to avoid it. These were outcasts. This was the essence of evil coming into contact with the essence of good, Jesus Christ. And this is where we see the authority of Jesus. The demons recognize Jesus and his authority before he says anything. He just walks up and they immediately recognize him for who he is. They recognize his power to torture them. And their only complaint is that it's before the appointed time, whatever that means. But obviously, both Jesus and the demons knew what they were talking about, but I doubt anybody else really does. Scholars have speculated on this for centuries. But somehow they scream, "Have you come to torture us before our time?" And then they ask Jesus, they say, "Look, let us go into the pigs." I'm guessing they thought they could buy more time for themselves if they went into the pigs. But the nature of evil is self-destruction. And if you just look around, you can see that. Lots of people make mistakes, but when you go into self-destructive mistakes, it's pretty obvious that evil is present. The pigs ran into the sea and died. And that just tells you the nature of demons. Whatever they're involved, they involve self-destruction, as you could see even with the crazy guy running around in the caves. So what can we observe from this theologically? Well, it's pretty clear God values the wholeness of a single human soul above the herd of animals in creation, any herd of animals. That he was concerned about this guy possessed with demons. And if a bunch of pigs needed to run into the sea to get him whole again, God wanted to again return this man to his created state, what God intended, and not what had befallen him. Jesus seemed to think that the other side was his side too. It's amazing. I'm sure the disciples of his, the fishermen even, tried to avoid the other side. But Jesus says, hey, let's go to the other side as if it's all his side. In fact, Jesus belongs to all sides. And that's something we need to see in this story as well. He healed Gentiles as well as Jews. And this wasn't the only case of that. That Jesus had compassion on even people outside the house of Israel, that the gospel, as was coming into being, the kingdom of heaven, was for all people of all nations. And this goes back to the promise to Abraham that through your seed all nations will be blessed. But a question for us is maybe, how many self-destructive demons are we dealing with that need to recognize the authority of Jesus? We read this story and we think, oh, that poor guy, and wow, what a blessing to be saved from these demons. But how many of us have invited our own demons into our lives? Oh, we want to be dedicated Christians, but we let a few things slide in on the side, maybe while God's not looking, as if that were possible. And I have a feeling we need to find the caves in our soul that we're hiding demons in. And we need to ask for the authority of Jesus to remove those in our own lives. The story is not just a story, it's a story for us to reflect on, learn from, and grow closer to Jesus as we understand these stories. The Gentiles weren't ready for Jesus. They asked him to leave. They were blown away by this power. They realized he had great power, but they didn't understand it. He was a Jew after all, and they thought Jews hated Gentiles. And so they asked him to leave. But Jesus left a very hard-to-ignore missionary there. He left the man who had been possessed by demons and now was free and in his own mind, dressed, clothed, and in his own mind. And he left him there. And that region, I'm sure, heard the story and came to see the man who had been in the caves. People had heard screaming at night, and now he was completely sane. That would have been hard to ignore that guy. And I have a feeling when the church began, that the gospel spread to this area very quickly because they were already pretty impressed with who Jesus is. What kind of insights can we get from this? Well, the authority of Jesus knows no geographical bounds, and we need to get that. I spent 10 years in Kenya. We actually opened up churches in areas where they had never known Jesus at all, where there were no other churches. And the missionaries, lots of stories about demonic activity in those areas, especially as they tried to bring the church in. Satan doesn't like to give up ground to Christianity. But when Christianity enters, the authority of Jesus is overwhelming, and there's nothing that can stop it. Jesus' authority knows no geographical bounds. There's no place you can go that God hasn't already been, isn't already there, and isn't already at work. And we need to recognize that no matter where we are, we talk about some God-forsaken place. Well, there is no such place. That God is interested in all of his creation, and he's interested in restoring it to what he intended in the beginning. Being a disciple of Jesus means having no geographical bounds as well. My parents were missionaries. I was born in Japan, spent the first 9 years of my life there. We came back to the States. I went to college, I got married, and me and my wife and soon-to-be children went to East Africa and shared the gospel. All of my children were born there. We need to understand that being a disciple of Jesus means having no geographical bounds ourselves. If we are called to go somewhere, we need to go. I've been very impressed with my parents. My father's 87, my mother's 84. And they were asked to go on a 6-month mission trip to Kathmandu, Nepal. And they're leaving soon. They heard the call and went. They understand that being a disciple of Jesus means having no geographical boundaries, that they will serve God anywhere God calls them to. And I hope and pray that I will maintain that same spirit all of my life. Jesus' authority knows no elemental bounds. They're out on the sea in a big storm. He steps up and rebukes the wind and the waves, and it stops. And the disciples were amazed at that, but if they really understood who Jesus is, they wouldn't have been surprised. Jesus' authority knows no spiritual bounds. They come in contact with demons. The demons recognize his authority immediately. They beg him to go into the pigs. They know he's the one in charge here. There's no contest between good and evil here. The power of Jesus is overwhelming. And there are no spiritual bounds that would hold Jesus in. There's no geographical areas that his power does not stand and overwhelm. As disciples of Christ, we should be blown away by this. This should be mind-boggling to realize we serve a God. We follow Jesus, the Word of God, and that there are no geographical boundaries, no elemental boundaries, or even spiritual boundaries that can keep him out. And we need to let that truth overwhelm us and give us the confidence to step into any situation and share the gospel of Jesus Christ through our lives, through our words, through our actions. And we have nothing to fear. Because if Jesus is with us, even if something awful happens, even if we die, we know that he'll see us right on through into heaven, into the presence of his Father. And so we don't need to fear anything. We just need to focus on being the disciples of Christ that he called us to be, and to answer the calling that he gives each one of us in our own special way with the gifts that he has given us. Some people always say, boy, I could never do what you did and go to Africa. And I always say, I couldn't either. If God wasn't working through us, we are helpless. And that stands to this day, if God does not work and talk through me, my words are meaningless. All of us need to understand that if we're working for Jesus, then he takes over. That's the whole point. We give up our lives to him, and then he can do amazing things through us. One of the things that has always bothered me is you read these stories, and you read many stories through the Gospels, where the demons just recognize the authority of Jesus immediately. And it bothers me that they seem to recognize the authority of Jesus more quickly than I do. I often have to debate with myself of what I should do. Well, I know something's wrong, or I'm about to say something wrong, or do something that's not very godly, and I have to sort of have this struggle and the demons just to me, oh, Jesus, you're in charge. They understand that. They don't even try to contest his power. They let it overwhelm them and do whatever he tells them. And they can only do what he allows them to do. And I pray, it's a daily prayer of mine, that I will allow Jesus his authority to overwhelm me on a daily basis the same way. Because it's easy to get distracted. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the pressures of the world. It's easy to get overwhelmed by painful experiences and sorrows. And we need to always remember, my life has been given to Jesus. It's not mine anymore. I do what he's called me to do, and I need to respond to his authority in any given situation immediately, without a struggle. Unfortunately, there's still a human part of me that continues to deal with our fallen nature in this world. And we need to constantly fight against that, make that a daily prayer, that we will be overwhelmed by the authority of Jesus. We want to share the gospel, to call people to radically submit their lives to Jesus Christ. I mean, that is the goal. That is the Great Commission. The Word of God, Jesus Christ, is what we are to submit to. Then we have to radically submit our lives first. We are the ones that need to display that, to put it out there so that people see that when we're calling them to follow Jesus, that we are setting the example, that we're going to make our lives conform to the will of Christ, and that's what we're calling them to do as well. That is the nature of the gospel, to radically conform and submit our lives to Jesus Christ. So what's the call to action today? Well, we need to first recognize Jesus has all authority. And we need to meditate on what that means, all authority. That means he can do anything, anywhere, under any circumstance. He is in charge. And if we work for him, if we're doing what he's called us to do, then he will see us through it. He will make it work. We don't have to make it work. He even tells us, don't even worry about what you're going to say, because I will give it to you when you need to say it. And I've experienced that many times in my life. Jesus calls us to serve him. And if we will do that, he'll take care of the rest. We just went through the Sermon on the Mount where it says, seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and then all of these other things will be added unto you. Instead of trying to seek those things, we seek God's will. We seek to answer our calling. And God will take care of the rest and even more. He doesn't just provide us what we need. He overwhelms us with his blessings. And so we need to really think about what it means for the person we have committed our lives to has all authority on heaven and on earth. And that means he'll take care of us no matter what is going on around us. Nothing happens outside the will of God. This is one of those great theological struggles that a lot of people have, because the fact is nothing happens outside of the will of God. He can either cause it or he can allow it, but he's in charge. And this brings up the whole question of, well, what about all the bad things that are going on in the world? And you know what? We can have that theological discussion. I'm not sure I really understand. He's God, I'm not, so I don't always understand when I see calamities and tragedies happening around the world. But I do know that he knows what he's doing, and I'm going to trust him. So whatever's happening, we need to understand God's in charge. He has all authority. And when bad things happen, my first prayer now, it took me years to learn this, but my first prayer now is, God, what are you trying to teach me? What do I need to learn during this difficult time. Because God's in charge. It doesn't happen by accident. And I've had this debate with many of my friends, fellow ministers, but the fact is I don't think God does random. I think he always knows what's going on. He always has a plan, and he's working his plan. And our free will is limited to whether we join him or not. But his will is going to happen, no matter what. We're called to live our lives with all of these realities riveted into our minds. Radical and extreme discipleship. That the focus of our existence is not our comfort, is not blending in, it's not just trying to cruise through life and enjoy things. That our extreme commitment to Jesus means I am constantly focused on what does God want me to do right now in this situation. Who does he want me to reach? Who is he putting in my path for me to share and impact with his Spirit, with his grace, and with his mercy? That's the goal of discipleship. Radical and extreme. Always has been, always will be. Thank you for joining me today.